Welcome to the Zero Input Agriculture podcast. And today I managed to land the biggest fish that I could ever possibly have hoped to get a chance to talk to. I'm joined by none other than David Holmgren, co-founder of Permaculture. So I've managed to lure David in here today to talk a bit more deeply about the potential synergies between selective breeding, particularly of plants and crops, and permaculture. And I just wanted to quickly start with a quote that I found from Permaculture One. I just reread it recently as a primer to get a sense of where the movement started with regards to this whole topic. And there's a quote: rural and urban permacultures will need an increase in the importation, generation, and dispersal of selected plant species. So it was there right in the very early days. And I'm curious if you have more to say about the potential synergy between permaculture and all of the techniques we have for breeding new crops.
Mm. Yeah, well, it's great to join you, Shane, and maybe the fish and lured is appropriate because I am a Piscean.
Ah,
But yeah, I suppose that I a big one way of looking at permaculture and its emergence was that it was part of the resurgence of interest in the applied scientific field of economic botany. What are all the plants and, for that matter, animals that are potentially useful to people that could be the basis of economies, and not just monetary economies, but non-monetary household economies? And that there's these phases. The 1970s was a phase of renewed interest in those sort of things. And there was an earlier phase very strong in the 1930s, and an earlier phase again in the 1870s to 1890s. And not just in Australia, but that 19th century phase was really part of what was being driven out of Kew Gardens at the centre of the British Empire, that what are all these useful plants? Because, of course, Europeans had experienced the massive increase in food productivity in gaining from the Americas corn and potatoes, amongst other things. And then things like rubber trees, being introduced to Malaya and creating benefits, the whole recognition of tree crops. So there's a whole aspect there that I think tends to come up when there's uncertainty about society's sustainability. So the big parallel with permaculture was the best book on useful plants of Australia. That was the title, more or less. Maiden's 1872. Republished a facsimile edition in 1972, and that was our best reference.
yeah.
A book from 100 years before. So that interest in economic botany tends to move interest away from how do we breed a better variety of apple or a better variety of wheat, to what about all the things that we're barely growing or we only have in completely unselected form? And so that immediately sort of that strategic starting point of permaculture: let's try a lot of species, not be too concerned about initially what's the ideal selection. And then early on in my journey with permaculture, a very influential time in New Zealand in 1979, 1 year after Permaculture One was published, was working with someone who I regard as my second mentor in permaculture, Hakai Tane, and then going back in 84 and working with him on chestnuts in the high country of New Zealand, and being a speaker, doing a presentation with him at the Tree Crops Conference. And so New Zealand had a Tree Crops Association of, people who are really into this stuff there that, we had no real parallel to that in Australia at that time. And one of the things that came out of what they found with looking at chestnuts is that when they asked members of the Tree Crops Association all over New Zealand what were the best bearing and vigorous chestnuts in their district. Just wild trees that have been, planted trees, not grafted trees. And they took the best 100 seed from the best 100 trees and then grew them alongside elite varieties brought in, like the American variety Paragon. And what they found with trials done at Lincoln University is that the local trees were actually better.
Mm.
And that, I think, is part of a subset that if you're actually going to introduce something completely new, it's actually better to start with seedling unselected stuff and then breed for the local environment,
Yes.
which I suppose relates to that sort of land race idea.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened in my understanding. I don't have as much understanding of it with macadamia because, of course, the modern macadamia industry came from seedlings planted in Hawaii that went just proliferated and grew everywhere and then went wild. They naturalized. And then in the 1930s, in my understanding, horticulturalists went through and gained elite trees from those and through that Hawaiian commercial varieties. And then those were brought back into Australia, but we had the natural pests and diseases of macadamia. And in the end, those varieties weren't that great here. And I don't know what happened, but my understanding there was then sort of some further breeding. And of course, we still had some remnants of the original, Queensland nut or popple nut, I think my parents called them, the unselected seedlings that had been spread, rescued from the rainforests that were cleared that originally had them. So I think there's some lessons there about, that something going wild in a place is a first basis of nature doing the job of selecting, and then drawing from that.
Macadamia is such an interesting example of something that's gone from a handful of very obscure wild species that have almost no direct utility, and then hybridization kind of kickstarts this process of accelerated evolution. And if people are there at that right time to get involved in that selection, you can end up with an organism that can be brought into symbiosis with human culture. That's probably kind of my broad theory. And if that happened within living memory, pretty much for macadamia, how many other species out there waiting to be brought into a harmonious relationship with humans? Not that like industrial macadamia farms are like the ultimate interpretation of that relationship. That's one extreme that's kind of driven by current, resources and economic kind of pressures, but there's something there. There's something there that's so profound and so powerful. But stimulating a culture that recognizes that pattern and then reproduces it, that's kind of the big challenge of the rest of my life and why I'm doing this podcast. If I can inspire other people to have a go with all of these wild species that are hanging on in the margins and, mostly ignored, that's what I would really love to do.
Yeah, well, there's so many threads in all that. I suppose one of the things is to deconstruct the idea that the domestic productivity that we have is all being bred in research stations. And so the big example I give is, of course, when apples were taken to North America, they went wild. European apples, well, they're not European apples, they're Kazakhstan apples, and that were moved by the Romans from Central Asia through to Western Europe. But in my understanding, apples, domestic apples, not crab apples, never really went wild in Western Europe to any significant degree. So new diversity, like really huge explosive diversity, didn't really emerge that much or that fast. Whereas when they were taken to North America, of course, the Johnny Appleseed story, which is partly a true story, is emblematic of that. They went wild. And then a century or so later, that created this horticultural gold rush of, companies buying the land that had the golden delicious on it. Or so, and we've had the same thing happen in southern Australia, that, apples didn't go wild en masse when Europeans arrived here. But in the last 60 years in southern Australia, there are wild apples everywhere through Tasmania, southern Victoria, central Victoria. And of course, as a result of that, it's not long before you actually find something that's pretty interesting.
Mm,
So that explosive, unleashed diversity that happens when something naturalizes and has exotic vigor, what people conventionally call become an environmental weed,
mm,
is actually where new diversity comes about. So I've argued that there's probably more genetic diversity in radiata pine, the predominant timber conifer of Australia, New Zealand, parts of South Africa, Chile, of course, some parts of Argentina, than all its original biodiversity in the little strip of country it comes from in coastal California.
mm.
Whereas the conventional view
Oh,
is
sorry.
that that origin point will always have the greatest diversity. But I think when things really go wild in a big way, it's like every hopeful monster gets a Guernsey.
Yeah,
Every half sort of, maladapted thing gets a chance to maybe prove that it's actually adapted to some other selection criteria, including human utility,
yeah.
that's not initially present.
It reminds me of what I may be wrong with this. I've looked for the papers on it and I can't find it again. But the history of lantana in Australia is that there were a limited number of ornamental varieties that were brought in. And this pattern is seen in many species that go on to become invasive. They're in the environment for often like hundreds of years, and then suddenly something happens and they just spread everywhere. And it's often tied back to a hybridization event. There's two relatively
Right.
distantly related versions of that organism. And then by chance in the right location, they cross over their genetics and it gives them this sudden boost. It's like a punctuated equilibrium phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah. And that relates to the pulsing dynamic balance between diversity and productivity
Mm,
in nature, that by things being separate, going their own path, it allows the possibility of more and more divergent and different possibilities. But then when those things come back together and hybridize, there's a power flush,
yes.
not
Yeah.
just in terms of for human utility purposes, yes, let's get some F1 hybrid seed. It's just generally in nature that hybridization process
Mm.
creates new possibilities, even though it is potentially diminishing, if that is very powerful, the presence of the precursor species or strains.
Yeah. Yep. That brings me to an idea that I've been floating around that humans have the potential to be the universal symbiont on planet Earth. And the model I use is when insects started pollinating plants, there was this massive explosion in the diversity of plant species because now they could all have different insects and different flowers, and it helped them kind of differentiate into different
Mm.
forms. But humans are unusual that like one, nominal species has the potential to influence the pollination and reproduction of pretty much anything else. Like I go out into the garden with
Yeah.
my little flexible human fingers and I can adjust them to pollinate anything. I don't need to be a different species of bird to reach into the flower and pollinate it.
Well, animal behavior is the leading fast moving edge of evolution, and especially higher, longer lived, large brained animals are the absolute pinnacle, not of the purpose of nature, but of how for things to adapt and change. And we see that, of course, in native animals, even extremely conservative ones like kangaroos that are just very conservative in their food habits of just eating grass, and then, drought stress can stand up and suddenly discover that these fruit trees are edible that they've ignored forever. So this change in animal behavior, well, surely that's our role preeminently is to say, how can we creatively use work our living from whatever there's too much of in nature?
Mm.
So that's our culling role of, okay, there's a lot of this. Can we sustain ourselves with that and flex our behavior to effectively what Mother Nature needs at that time? But
Yeah. Yeah.
she has to wait for something to come along to fill that niche or suppress back that thing that there's too much of or whatever. So I think that is a larger role. But your interview got me thinking about something I've said about the whole tree crop breeding thing, because a lot of the selection that we understood with trees, of course, was not seed selection, but actually clonal
Mm.
reproduction. That once you have something, you're reproducing that by grafting or cutting or whatever's appropriate to the plant, but you're producing a genetically identical thing. Now, give and take, there's some species that, like citrus, that sort of do some funny things along the way, and seeds that can be partly clonal and whatever. That mostly when we're growing from seed, we've got that diversity, but we don't have necessarily the true praise. So to get something really useful in the tree crop, there was generally this, okay, it's got to be clonal.
Mm.
And what I think we didn't understand originally, and certainly for a long time, is that there was work happening around hybrid swarm populations in trees, that another couple of people at the same time that Mollison and Holmgren were looking at tree crops, there were some people in the Midwest of the United States that took this idea of, can we breed, well, in their case, hazelnuts, chestnuts, and pecans at what became the Badgerset Research
Mm.
Centre.
Mm.
And they now have hazel and chestnut, I think, that rivals corn and soybeans for protein and starch production on the best Midwest land.
Mm.
So they've actually proven on that very best of land, it's possible to have the super high productivity that has been associated with highly bred annual crops, and yet have all of the ecosystem service benefits and biomass accumulation of a tree crop
Mm.
system. Now, that's taken them quite a while, and my understanding it was they got all the hazelnut species of the world and just grew them as seed together,
Mm.
and they got natural hybridization, and then they just selected for the ones that obviously grew vigorously, but firstly for precociousness, what
Mm.
came into seed bearing early. And of course, with trees, that can be quite a few years to wait before you've, oh, okay, that's a really interesting nut. And then just constantly selecting for that. So they have something which actually has the selection that and productivity we associate with clonal things, but still having actually genetic diversity of a seedling population.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be done. It can be
Yeah,
done.
and so I sometimes say, well, if Mollison and Holmgren had just stuck to that first core issue in permaculture and spent our whole lives on that rather than permaculture spreading off and becoming a theory of everything, maybe we would have got somewhere, whether it was with one of your interests in activities in bunya pines or in oaks or whatever.
Mm.
Because it is a long task to do these things, and governments and corporations don't seem interested in that work at all. So it does appear to be up to committed
Well,
people.
tree crops in particular, like when you've got suitable genetics for the location that you're in, they should be a case of all you have to do is get them started and then come back in 5 or 10 or 20 years to harvest. If they're well adapted to your location and the broad
Yeah.
landscape management is suitable, then they should do most of the work themselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, the Badger Set Research Station is at the other end of the spectrum of actually including fertility input and management to be able to even machine harvest, but
Mm.
sort of pushing that, okay, what are the biological limits of tree crops? But yes, that other end that has also been a major theme in permaculture of how do we have very low input systems that are obviously actually less productive, but on balance turn out to be better for the environment, better for people, allow things to tick over more like a natural ecosystem with
Mm.
the less inputs and still hopefully, very substantial yields and productivity.
Well, in my little corner of the woods, bunya nuts, that category, like they're
Yes.
so well suited to this location that you usually see them like rolling around on the side of the road. Nobody knows what to do with them. And a big chunk of my diet every year comes from bunya nuts now that I've figured out how to process them. That it's a process to learn how to do that, but you get there with persistence. But before we move on to some other things, I have been knocking around a thought lately that maize is the only fully domesticated plant.
Ah, right. So because it's been so
It's been so
hard,
transformed.
yeah, yeah, and doesn't really revert back to, well, not obviously in the short term anyway,
Mm.
back to
It has almost zero
what
potential to go feral and like say, see you humans, thanks for the tortillas and the parties, but I'm heading off in my own direction. It's kind of locked in at this stage.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think that there's elements of that in symbiosis generally that you can think of the lichen and the algae, the lichen from algae and fungi, where things are so locked together they actually no longer exist as independent lives.
Mm. Mm.
I don't know whether that's true for us and our dependence on corn, but yeah, the maybe the dependence of corn on us. Yeah, I mean, there's been various things said about the putting down the idea of potential new tree crop breeding too. Like I remember Jared Diamond suggested in his work that, almonds were selected from bitter almonds for various reasons, but oaks, you know, have never been really selected, he claimed,
Mm.
for low tannin content. And yet there's 500 species of oaks in the world, similar to eucalypts, over a huge number of biomes. And in our part of the world, oak is sort of really the tough equivalent of what you're saying
Mm.
of bunya, although bunyas grow here as well and have survived on some stunningly harsh sites in central Victoria for more than 100 years, even though they're very slow to get going. And similarly, a lot of oaks are pretty slow to get going, but we've seen them to be consistently as drought hardy or more drought hardy than eucalypt species, including the local indigenous ones. And of course, they produce this large starch nut, but it's got varying amounts of tannin in, which, of course, can be leached out with processes that are not too complex.
Mm.
But the potential for hybridization between oaks, and we're sort of like at the kindergarten level with oaks still.
Mm.
There's I mean, just one of my obsessions, of course, is that oaks are naturally fire retardant or not fire enhancing trees. So that's very significant in southern Australia. But we're also have the benefits from trees that are deciduous, and then we get winter rain and grass and other things can grow,
Mm.
and then we have the canopy. And of course, there's evergreen oak species, and there's ones that are semi-evergreen, which typically come from the Mediterranean. But there's these other oak species that hold their dry leaves over the winter and then shed them with the first flush of buds.
Ah.
Now, they are typically, in my observation, continental species like pin oak, and maybe it's something to do with catching snow, or I don't know what makes plants do that. But I've never seen any literature about the fact that this leaf retention occurs in the common English oak, which is like 90% of the oaks planted in southern Australia. And the second generation, we've had nursery rows of oaks where we go along and in winter, there's one that's fully shed, there's one that's got a bit of semi-evergreen characteristics, and there's one that's a leaf retainer.
Mm.
And we want the ones that shed their leaves fully or a semi-evergreen, because the trees that shed their leaves in the spring is leaving dry leaves for the fire season.
Yeah.
And no one is talking about this stuff. And of course, if you're a landscape architect and, designing, selecting trees for access, sun access for passive solar buildings, I mean, this thing of when trees drop their leaves, and if they drop them, is critically important. But even in that ornamental horticultural field, no one seems to have any clue or almost any interest. And yet these things are so significant in terms of any selection or breeding and what is actually happening wild, because we know a lot of the oaks are actually quite promiscuous at crossing. And then in addition to that, we know that the English oak is really the same thing as Quercus lusitanica, the Portuguese oak. It's just separated by the English Channel, which is only 8,000 or 10,000 years old. And so Quercus lusitanica is just a bit more drought hardy, a bit more tendency to keep its leaves. But those same characteristics in English oak immediately show up grown second generation in Australia.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this tree that supposedly comes from this cool, damp climate actually is really, really tough in southern Australia, because hidden within it, it has all these other genetics. And I think that's the same with Bunya, because Bunya once covered the whole continent.
Yeah. 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 There's a little remnant population way up in Cairns that most people don't know about. That
Right.
yeah, pretty much so the eastern half of Queensland not that long ago was covered in conifer forests that were fire sensitive.
Yeah. Well, in 1975, when I was working on all this stuff in Hobart and going to the Hobart Botanic Gardens and seeing the grove of bunyas, and there's bunya nuts bearing, and like that was this, oh, these trees don't actually require all that heat units that they have
Hmm.
in Queensland.
The potential for the crop is like at least an order of magnitude bigger than macadamia.
Yeah.
Particularly for permaculture style situations, because you can, once they're established, even when they're half established, grazing animals around them on marginal land, like there's just so many stacked uses that can happen there. And mixing in the genetics from the South American relatives, the monkey puzzle for more cold tolerance, the piranha pine for faster maturation. Oh, the potential is just jaw-dropping.
Well, I don't know uh, where the place is where the three could go together, because I don't know whether there's other people, but I might be the only person who's eaten all three species.
Ah, it's
Because
too
we're,
warm here for monkey puzzles, so I've kind of
yeah,
given up on
well,
them, but the piranhas do very well.
yeah, well, I've been to those forests in southern Brazil, and it's very like the Maloney Plateau. But I've also been to visit the monkey puzzles, and I had no idea how high up the mountains they are.
Mm.
They are the tree line species
Wow.
in the equivalent of Tasmania's latitude, where the tree line is about 1,000 metres. These trees are growing at 2,000 metres above sea level. And what the other vegetation surrounding them is various species of southern beech, Nothofagus, related to the Tasmanian species, little deciduous shrubs, essentially, at 2,000 metres. And these things stand up as these huge sentinels, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And the year we were there, in 2007, people said, well, you might not be able to get there. It's been one of the heaviest snow fall seasons. And as we went up the mountains through the Tasmanian blue gum and radiata pine plantations, they were all smashed by the snow. And then we went up into the bigger Nothofagus, native Nothofagus, and they were all broken by the snow. And the snow was 4 meters deep on either side of the road. And we get out at this plateau going across to the Argentinian border. And there's this frozen lake. And at the end of the lake is this huge stand of these monkey puzzles, totally unaffected by the snow.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
behind them is an active volcano to 4,000 meters covered in. No, but yeah, these things come from a pretty cool place, which probably explains why people manage to grow them in Scotland.
Mm.
But we do have them, the odd specimens, in botanic gardens in around our area, but they're not as common and they're not as vigorous or hardy as bunyions in our area. But yeah, those three are the great species of araucarias that all have the big nut. I mean, it's interesting that both the monkey puzzle and Apana pine, the shell is a lot thinner and redder and easier to break apart than the bunya, but the nuts are not actually quite as big. But they're very similar taste-wise.
And they hybridize if you can line them up in time and space. So
I'm sure.
yeah, there's an explosion waiting to happen, but it's like 60 million years in the making, 30 million years, read about that they've been separated.
Right.
So yeah,
Right.
and it takes an improbable enough creature like humans to bring them back together again in the blink of an eye. Uh, Moving on, how much plant breeding is already happening in permaculture? Because I'm a little bit of a loner hermit. I like to think I'm on the abundant edge of permaculture. Like I'm exploring kind of boundary topics. So what's happening in the heart of permaculture? Are there many people doing crop and tree breeding to any extent that you know of?
I don't think so. I think there's many people who've established arboreta and stands of things that may have potential for emergent stuff for another generation. And at the garden level with annuals, I think there's people doing various things. I think there's been an interesting move of focus beyond heirloom species of vegetables to landrace breeding. And I was actually talking about that with local colleague Speedy Ward, who's an extraordinary plant collector and breeder, both of sort of trees and annuals. And he was telling me about other people in our region who are very interested in the landrace idea of getting all different seed of say pumpkins and just growing those, letting them all cross and then selecting from that. So you actually get something adapted to your soils, your climate, which is really how most of the heirloom varieties originated. But like anything, those can become, if you like, inbred in the same way that animal breeding needs that sort of renewal of the wild. Yeah, so my writing and teaching partner, Beck Lowe, who's very much an animal person and is working on a book on animals in permaculture, she's done that with poultry, of having a semi-wild flock through her orchard, which is mainly for beneficial purposes, and they're tough, hardy. They raise chicks themselves in a full wildlife protection fence, so she has that protection, but she hardly ever gets the eggs because they're sort of hidden so well, but she culls, eating birds out of that flock, and she has all different colours and shapes and sizes, but it's sort of progressively developed in not a huge number of years, less than 2 decades, almost her own strain.
It's interesting to point out that chickens have a hybrid origin as well. There's 3 different jungle fowl that were mixed together to make the foundation of that ubiquitous bird. And you may not know about this, not far from me in Gympie in the 80s, somebody artificially crossed brush turkeys with Australorp chickens. And the
Really?
resulting offspring, they called them the small Turks, were completely fertile. I tried to figure out what happened to that material because he was old and he retired and he gave it to other people. And but that is a really, really wide cross. I think they're in different families, like that they could come
Whoa.
together that easily and just I think the only issue they had is the chicks had a bit of a hard time getting out of the eggshells because they were so thick, but with a little bit
Right.
of assistance, that's all it took. And doing an artificial insemination to get it started.
Wow.
So yeah, the idea of a poultry that is robust enough to free range around villages surrounded by like bunya groves and grazing goats and all that kind of stuff, that could be a potential route to create something
Yeah.
completely new. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask that somewhere in Permaculture One it mentions that wallabies could potentially be domesticated. Do you have any further thoughts on that or other Australian species that run under our
Well,
nose, like waiting for us to pay attention to them?
well, it's interesting that I can remember talking with colleague Peter Brew, who my essay about bunyias is dedicated to his memory. And we were speculating in the late 70s about um, brush turkey as could this actually be domesticated and be a sort of a forest fuel composting bird that was actually sort of composting the forest litter I mean various people have said point out the limitations of that, but clearly the brush turkeys seem to be colonizing human habitat everywhere. And he was talking about the reintroduction of brush turkey also as a wild component in southern Australian forests too, as a fuel reducing bird. And these things of where were the territorial boundaries of these species. I you know I think a lot of the macropods, including Tasmanian wallabies, are certainly able to be tamed to an amazing degree. And I think there's been a bit of a cultural and even legal framework in Australia around wildlife conservation to keep humans and wildlife separated,
Mm.
so that, yes, having pets or any of these things has been discouraged, and whether that's, for all sorts of good reasons or whatever. But I think also there's a case that I've argued in relation to kangaroos that we should consider them as part of a common
Mm.
wild, but that they should be managed as part of the whole system rather than that. Can we breed these down to a fully domestic controlled animal? And I think there's some similar relationships with another difficult flighty animal is deer.
Mm.
Yes, we can have them in enclosures and special things for, stock drafting, but they're naturally flighty,
Mm.
difficult animals. And really, a managed wild harvesting, I think, can move to the point where you develop relationships between people and the older breeding animals where they know that you're not after them in culling the animal population, but that you're sort of have some harvesting role, but essentially the animals are still wild and free in the landscape. Now, obviously, there's a lot of people in southern Australia at the moment who are gritting their teeth about the gradual or not so gradual expansion of deer
Mm.
and what it's doing to their gardens or other places. And those changes in behaviour that animals have as they adapt to human systems. But I think that is more akin to the management that Indigenous people did with a lot of these animals, that, they burnt areas and knew that when they came back, that would have sweet grass on it, and the kangaroos would be gathered there.
Mm.
And of course, from an ecological hunting point of view, it makes sense never to kill the large breeding animals to take the young ones, especially the surplus males.
Mm.
So that possibility of not domestication, full control, but some sort of symbiotic influence over a population is probably where mostly I would see those options.
The relationship between the Sami and their reindeers is probably a really good example showing that domestication isn't a binary. It isn't just some animal locked in a cage or one that's completely wild. There's a spectrum exists
Yes.
in how you interact with different species.
Yes, well, it's interesting. The large power animals, the largest power animal, logging in the forests of Burma for centuries, and yet these are not strictly domesticated animals, and yet there's this intimate relationship between, the person who in the economy, the traditional economy, was actually less valuable than
Then
the
the
elephant,
elephant, yeah.
and he is the servant of the elephant, and of course there's all sorts of horrible stories in the modern world where the treatment of these elephants has been so bad, and I think some of that is partly because they've been replaced by fossil fuel and are no longer valuable. But when they were valuable, they were sort of in some ways more cared for. But that sort of quite strong relationships that can occur without actually it being properly classified as a domestic
Yeah.
animal.
It's
Uh,
actually one of the most radical suggestions in my book, Taming the Apocalypse, that we have a limited window to properly domesticate elephants. And the way we could probably do it is by hybridizing African and Asian elephants. And they can cross. They have crossed in zoos before, and they've produced perfectly healthy young that were actually killed to maintain the purity of the lines.
oh, yes.
And one of the reasons why I think it might be so important is for humans to successfully manage forest ecosystems. We either need like chainsaws and axes to balance that vegetation growth to like have a positive impact on it, to not just let it grow completely out of control. But without all of that technology, the only thing that could be potentially sustainable would be something like an elephant. And in the same way that cattle made human managed grassland ecosystems possible, maybe we
Yes.
need something like an elephant to make forest ecosystems manageable by humans without technology.
That's a quite wild out there idea, Shane. But yes, yeah, and all of these thoughts about those interconnections and potentials are important. I mean, I think there's still so much work at so many levels to do, and it does seem to me that these things are down to what individuals and sometimes wealthy people can support projects, but we don't see much of philanthropy in the environment scene that addresses these questions. There's mostly around how can we urgently save what we're losing, and
Mm,
then anything to do with productivity is somehow like this other opposite thing,
mm,
whereas so much of permaculture is actually about seeing all these things in flow from a holistic perspective rather than this binary. And that more holistic view was there in the origins of land care in Australia, which, there was quite strong crossover. But it then divided into, no, that's for conservation over there, and this is for production. And these two different realities that then go off in completely different directions or attempt to compromise one another, by the classic, oh, well, there's the indigenous revegetation along the creek corridor, and here's the super productive farm
mm.
that moves towards intensive monoculture
Yeah.
in the same landscape, which is, of course, a nonsense because one then starts to mix with the other, whether you like it or not.
Mm.
Nature's going to mix those things up. So, yeah, how to see that those things are actually an important part of not just human futures, but nature's future. And I mean, within forestry, there's a little curious example that probably our most valuable timber tree that in practice, rather than economically, radiata pine, the even more threatened Cypress macrocarpa, Monterey cypress, is the timber our house is built of. It's got half the shrinkage rate of radiata pine, very stable timber, naturally durable, beautiful figure in it. And all the woodworkers in Southern Australia know how good it is, and there's lots of salvage logging. But it's a rough tree with huge branches and ingrown bark, and it grows in the salt spray zone on the Monterey Peninsula. It's not surprising that the recovery of timber out of logs is not that great, even though they grow. But in Britain in the 19th century, an intergenera cross between Cypress macrocarpa and Nootka spruce created the Leylandii cypress, which has now been, there's all sorts of ornamental horticultural selections of it, and they've been planted. All the horse properties have got them as shelter belts, single row shelter belts. And, us timber workers are looking greedily at those to see, some of them are getting now to 30 years old. We want to know whether those nice cylindrical round trunks that they have with small fine branches actually have the beautiful wood quality of the Cypress macrocarpa. Because, there's an improvement in timber genetics that came about by these trees just being grown together in an estate garden and created that relatively rare intergenera cross. And so I think lots of examples, more of these things must be there waiting to happen or waiting to be found.
And yeah, we definitely can't wait for like professional industrial plant breeders to do it because they have their own priorities that are very different to ours.
Yes, and often they take the wonderful solutions of nature and then, as I suggested in my essay, they turn them back into the same old problem. So we have wonderful plants like the tropical oil palm, that is now has this horrendous reputation because of what industrial corporate monoculture has done with it.
Don't blame
And
the plant.
yes,
Now, as somebody who's trying to help start the ball rolling, getting more people involved in realizing they can breed their own crops on, annuals, perennials, trees, on all levels, whatever interests you. Could you help me reflect on why permaculture was so successful as a movement? Like, as you said, there was similar attempts that came and went before, and I think permaculture is the first one that had a lingering impact. So I'm trying to do some like sheer total utter neglect mass selection on social engineering on this front.
well, that's a complex one and a difficult one to say with any certainty. But I think to some extent there's a thing of timing, and I think permaculture caught the first big wave of modern environmentalism, and especially triggered around the oil crises of the 1970s, where there was this huge interest in all of these diverse subjects. So I say, what was it that encouraged 15 publishers approaching a cantankerous and largely unknown academic from Tasmania and a completely unknown graduate student wanting to publish the manuscript of Permaculture 1 in 1977? So there was this huge interest in these sorts of things at that time, and the forces that allowed permaculture to develop as a movement with the very much the charismatic leadership of Mollison and develop into a movement rather than just an idea. And so the PDC, the permaculture design course, was definitely a part of that mechanism that allowed it to survive the dark days of the 80s until the late 80s, when a second wave of
Yeah.
modern environmentalism hit. Even if that wave mostly ignored the food and agriculture side, which was predominant or a major part of that first wave.
Mm.
So then the second wave became much more focused on tech and greenhouse gas emissions and not so much on biology or human behavior,
Mm.
which then came back in another wave in the 2000s, so
Mm.
this resurgence. So I think there's some of those things are luck. And I think, I suppose, there's always this balance between the novel of the attraction of a new idea or a recast idea. And of course, there were people in the early days of response to permaculture and say, oh, that's just Russell Smith's tree crops idea, a permanent agriculture, which was, of course, from the 1930s
Mm.
wave. And yes, permaculture was more than that, but it was definitely reframing a lot of those ideas. So there's reframing of things for to suit a particular time, I think. And, I think those possibilities, I think within the practical sense, the getting highly productive food gardens with seed saving, an element that is both broad in permaculture generally and kindred networks of community gardens and all that idea of seed saving and the incredible book, The Seed Saver's Handbook, which has been such a continuous, bestseller by Jude and Michelle Fanton. Even though a lot of that focus has been on saving what already exists,
Mm.
I think people's experience with realizing the genetic rundown that can occur with heirlooms, and then also just the stuff up. Oh, well, I was trying to keep that pure and it's actually crossed with that.
Oh, yeah.
This freeing up of,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, maybe we can deliberately go that way of
Hmm.
actually throwing a lot of things and together. And because, annuals that are really productive and useful and getting that feedback, the idea that you can create a bit of a strain in, less than a whole lifetime.
It's
uh,
surprisingly fast. It's surprisingly
yeah,
fast and
yeah,
surprisingly powerful. The change in performance that you see within a few generations is quite astonishing. If you haven't seen it yourself, you wouldn't believe it's possible.
yeah. So we certainly have elements of that show up in our permaculture teaching, and people like Speedy Ward, who I mentioned, who people go and see his place and his passion, and he was he was involved in some of the early properties that Mollison developed in northern New South Wales and has been involved in permaculture for a long time. But he's, classic of that experimenter, person always doing trials and different things, including he's a great inoculator of trees with beneficial edible fungi
He
and has
sounds like the kind of
transformed.
person I need to talk to.
Ah, yeah, yes. Yeah, he would be good to, perhaps get on the podcast.
One instinct, like again, thinking about timing, like your time in history, what are the resources and opportunities and the background conditions you have right now? And my instincts have started making me think about the growing homeschooling movement. And there's so many
Mm,
plant breeders that I talk to, they refer back to some childhood experience that they grew some crop and it accidentally hybridized and it excited them. And that started
right,
a whole lifetime of crop breeding. And there's
right.
so many, there's ever-growing numbers of homeschooling children whose parents are sympathetic to these kind of ideas. And they're sitting around for 10 years in their early life with all that energy, hopefully a little bit of space, and maybe the curiosity that hasn't been beaten out of you that typically happens with mainstream schooling. So
Mm,
yeah, I'm starting to think a book or some kind of program that helps young people in that position learn how to breed a crop, like pick an annual, and within a few years, and it's interesting for children that young, the standard line is, oh, they don't have the patience.
yeah,
And I think enough of them do, Because children aren't all the
Yeah,
same. There's some of them that can be
exactly.
get very obsessed on particular topics.
Yeah, I think there's great potential in that area, and certainly the freedom to explore and focus and be persistent in the home education context. And yeah, that freedom to do something that the adults actually aren't doing
Hmm.
or don't know about, because I think there's a degree to which children growing up in a diverse, rich environment with lots of learning opportunities initially attempted to copy their parents and the older siblings and whatever. But then what they do is they often start to identify the missing niches,
Hmm.
the things that, are not being occupied. So it's not necessarily the greatest success would be the children of enthusiastic adults who actually are already in that territory,
Mm.
uh, but the parents who are, yeah, familiar and supportive. And it's interesting in our own family, Oliver, whose place I'm at, who's 38, when he was a baby on the building site, he just osmotically absorbed a lot of building skills and whatever. But I was very much the woodworker. And by the time he was 14, he was a better welder than I was. And he just sort of moved into that niche, that vacant niche. And there's so many vacant niches in a rich, diverse, self-reliant households that children can do. And I think that's definitely one of them. Often too, things that are small and fine, like seeds and like pollination of
Yeah,
flowers,
yeah.
is something that's great for kids. Because I remember when Oliver was very young, he'd push something right in front of my nose and say, "Look at this." And I try and push it away because my sight didn't, you know, even in my 40s, my sight didn't focus that well. Whereas, of course, I realized, oh, he could actually focus at, you know, 6 inches and less from his nose. And so children, yeah, so, to do with like very fine
Mm,
things that sometimes uh, that work involves is a great one.
mm. Oh, you've given me a bit of encouragement to follow that path and see where it leads me and do it quickly because yeah, the time in the sun comes and goes. The time in history time comes and goes. And if you blink,
Yeah,
you'll miss it.
yeah.
So if people want to catch up with more that you've done recently, have you got any books or other things that you'd like to mention to get
Oh,
them
well,
interested?
yeah, there's a lot of my writings are now on the Holmgren website, and I'm been fairly prolific recently, with all sorts of ideas across a range of subjects, but also been starting to write more s stories of things from the past that documenting for the first time. And there's a major essay called A Table of Many Stories, which is about my theories about the most fought over of the old growth forests of southern Australia and my theories about their origins that conflict with the ecological and forestry orthodoxies and about the age of these largest of the flowering plants in the world that I believe they actually live for much longer than science has conventionally said. And these are ideas that I developed back in the 70s, and presented at various events, but have never written down. So that, yeah, things of reflecting on those ideas and bringing those to life with storytelling and in some cases pictures from the past, pictures from those times.
Brilliant. I'll
Uh,
put all the links to that in the show notes, and I'm looking forward to checking it out now when it comes out.
okay, yeah, well, that one's up on the website, as is another one called Saving Warner's Track, which is about my time in Jackie's Marsh in Tasmania. Yeah, and there's various resources. We're doing more online teaching these days, and my partner Sue Dennett is the star of a thing called Do with Sue, which is her practical in the kitchen things. And yeah, so there's a lot of resources there that we're involved with.
Brilliant. Well, I'll put links to all of that. You can send them through to me and I'll put them up. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. This has been fascinating and inspiring, and I'm eternally grateful.
Oh, keep up the good work, Shane.
I'll be doing loads more interviews from this point on. So yeah, this is a great start to the new podcast launch. So thank you very much.
Okay.
The Zero Input Agriculture podcast is a solo passion project built with my ample time and meagre resources. If you would like to support the show, then sign up for a paid subscription to my Zero Input Agriculture blog at Substack. As a reward, you can read all my past posts and listen to the audiobook of Taming the Apocalypse. If you prefer reading about the past and future of biological technology, you can read the ebook of Taming the Apocalypse through Amazon. And finally, please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you use, since it helps other people find me. Or recommend the show directly to anyone who could use some inspiration to become a plant breeder themselves.